Okay, thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to get us started, and I'm going to start with some introductions. This is Academic Library Impact, and it's some strategies for engaging you with research around the value of academic libraries, and includes some funding opportunities should you need that to pursue your research. My name is Holly Mercer. I'm Senior Associate Dean at the University of Tennessee Libraries, and I am Chair of the ACRL Value of Academic Libraries Committee. Also joining me today is Jill Becker, who is head of the Center for Undergraduate Initiatives and Engagement at the University of Kansas. And she is vice chair of the Value of Academic Libraries Committee. Third speaker is Stephanie McKiddish. Stephanie is user engagement and assessment librarian at Rutgers University. She's a member of the VAL committee, and importantly for the discussion today, she is also one of the authors of Academic Library Impact, Improving Practice in Essential Areas to Research, which is a publication that was released in late 2017, and we will refer to it numerous times in the next hour. And fourth speaker is Sarah Geck, who is a Mellon ACLS Public Fellow and a Program Manager at ACRL. And Sarah, if you'll advance to the next slide. Okay, and here you see that publication that I referred to, Academic Library Impact. It is something that I heard recently. It was referred to as the Bible for conducting research in value of academic libraries and student engagement. It was written with the practitioner in mind, and it was written by two people who were PhD students at the time. Stephanie was one of them, also a software engineer, and it was done under the leadership of a researcher from OCLC, Lynn Conaway, who has published extensively and written textbooks on research methods in library and information science. So the Academic Library Impact publication, it's a research agenda. It was highly researched, and it is designed to really help you get started in your own research. Two questions that researchers ask when they get started is, or if they have an idea of what they want to pursue, what has been studied previously, what has previous research found, what are the gaps or questions that remain that need to be pursued, and how will I apply it to my own research. And if you'll advance to the next slide, please. Academic Library Impact is broken down into 6 priority areas, and you see them listed there. So I'm not going to go into or read them to you. But essentially, these are priority areas, and the publication identifies research questions that require further exploration. So if you don't have your own research questions in mind around the impact or value that academic libraries bring in their institutional settings, the Library Impact or Research Agenda outlines some of those for you that you could take a look at. If you'll go to the next slide. Okay, at this point I am going to look to Sarah to, there we go. Please have a look at the priority areas and indicate which one you would be most interested in pursuing in your own line of research. The feedback that you provide will help inform a program that will be offered at ALA annual conference. We've selected content for this presentation based on what we thought people might be interested in, but we really do want to see what your areas of interest are in these 6 priority areas. So we'll give you a little time to think about it and respond. Okay, let me close the poll. All right, well, we have interest in all areas, but it looks like quantify the library's impact on student success is a favorite. Thank you very much. Okay, and we will continue on. This is a representation of the research cycle. So if you have your research question identified, this is the process that you would use to investigate. It shows it in a highly stylized way. It's cyclical in nature. It has every stage represented. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. But you'll see this is really more what the research process looks like. While it is cyclical in nature, there really are parts, there are times where you will diverge from that cycle, and with good reason, because you want your research to take you somewhere. So it may not always be as neatly in practice as it is in that first representation. But librarians are well suited for research. We tend to enjoy doing research, investigating, looking up information, organizing it, making it usable for others. And we know a good story when we see one. That is, it needs to have a coherent narrative, interesting characters or plot, and we're generally interested in learning from both the student and teacher perspective. Okay, thanks. A good research question, and that's the basis for building on kind of a program of research. But a good research question is specific. It will answer questions such as which one? If you want to study students, do you want to study undergraduates, graduate students, transfer students, first-year students, first-generation students? It may not always need to be that specific, but it's really useful to think in those terms. Your research question should have a testable and measurable result or outcome. That is, for it to be a line of research, it should not be a philosophical question. It needs to be knowable, but not an accepted fact. A good research question is complex. That is, you can't answer it with a yes or no. it needs to be significant and broadly relevant. So if it's something that's just of interest to you in a very specific situation and it can't be generalized or useful to others, it may not be a good research question. And it should have some degree of creativity. That is, you are using a new approach. It's something that hasn't already been answered, or if it's a research question that's been asked and answered, you're going to use a different methodology in exploring your own answer to the question. Your research question will dictate the kinds of research methodologies you use that underpin your work, whether you use quantitative methods, qualitative methods, or mixed methods, that is both qualitative and quantitative. You should also consider what data you have already available that can help you answer your research question. Don't overlook what data you might already have in your current environment. There isn't always reason to gather new data if you can look to what you already have available to you. And with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming out. I see quite a few people that I've met at conferences, and I see even some of the researchers that we cited and used in our report. So I'm really happy you could come out, either live in person now, or perhaps you're tuning into the webinar at a later date. So one of the reasons why Holly, Jill, and Sarah asked me to co-present this webinar was to give a little bit of insight into sort of like the behind the scenes decisions of the project. What I always like about academia is that you have the chance to engage with the researchers and ask why they made certain choices, either when they were designing the study or when they were writing it up. So I encourage you to take this opportunity to ask any questions you might have, and of course my contact info will be put up at the end as well. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about that we didn't really talk about in any of our previous presentations was where this idea for the visualization tool came from. It actually came about while we were writing the proposal to ACRL in order to be awarded the chance to do this project. Now, Lynn, Vanessa, and we had collaborated on a few other projects together before, and one of the questions that we like to ask our participants is, if you had a magic wand, how would you use it to change a library collection, space, or service? And what would it be? What would it do? What would it look like, etc.? So we applied that question to ourselves and asked if we used a magic wand to create a tool that would help librarians who are interested in doing research on student learning and success, what would it look like? Well, first, of course, we wanted to be comprehensive. So we went out of our way to find research and projects beyond what was indexed by EBSCO or ProQuest. We wanted to include things like the assessment and action projects or proceedings from conferences like the Library Assessment Conference. And we wanted all that to be accessible so that researchers who are doing research in the area would just have this pool of all kind of like the most recent studies that they could look at. We also attached the relevant metadata to them, which I'll go into a little more detail later. And we created that into the literature search tool. Now, we also wanted this pool of studies to be updatable, but we didn't want to be the ones that had to do the updating. So fortunately, the Value of Academic Library Committee said that they would be in charge and they would add studies to the tool as time went on. So that was great. We also had this really pie-in-the-sky idea because we wanted a way to support better visualizations for data than what just Microsoft Excel could provide. So ideally, it would be something like Tableau, but without the price tag. This meant that it would probably have to be something that used open source components. Now, open source tools do exist, but generally you have to learn something like R or Python, and that could be an issue because the learning curve for those programs, it's a little steep. Well, fortunately, Lynn had worked with William, our software engineer, before, and not only did he say he could build something like an open source Tableau, but he would also create the database. So of course, then he was added right away to our team. And so that idea of like a visualization that was something like an open source Tableau, that became known as the charts and graphs component of the visualization tool. So the pictures there, some videos for how to use the tools are there. So please use it. That's what it was there for. Now, with the visualization tool and the priority areas, as Holly mentioned, they were designed for a wide range of potential librarian researchers. With the literature search component of the tool, it's probably easier to guess what we were thinking when we were designing that part of the tool. For instance, if a librarian was interested in a type of institution or a study population or a specific library resource, we have faceted searching that supports that. If they want to see what the studies in a certain priority area looked like, because maybe they wanted to apply for a research grant through ACRL, which would ask them to identify the area that their study fell in, well, they could use it for that too. If they wanted to see what methods were used in the study or how a certain methodology was written up, there are facets that support that. And of course, if they wanted to just do a plain old Boolean support keyword search through the relevant literature, well, the tool supports that as well. Sarah, could you go to the next slide, please? So now moving on to the priority areas. With these areas, we wanted to look at things from both a researcher and a practitioner level, and then different sublevels. So what do I mean by that? Well, for each priority area, we start with a very general discussion, and that's usually where we define our terms. And as we go through that area, we sort of funnel down from very general aspects of that area to more specific ones. So in this specific area, which is about enhancing teaching and student learning, it was important to define what student learning was and how it differed from student success. As often happens in scholarly literature, different researchers were using different definitions for these related concepts. In the report, we talk a little bit more in detail. We have citations about the way these four different ways of conceptualizing these terms came about. In general, the first one kind of defined learning as a component of success. Another one said that, well, actually, student success programs supported learning. A third one said that learning actually referred more to degree-related things, such as courses or programs, and then student success was more related to students, so things like retention or completion or persistence. And a fourth definition said that success in learning occurred on a spectrum, where success was more objective and measurable, and then learning was just less so. Now, we went with the last definition because we figured if a researcher was interested in studying something that was more measurable, perhaps because they had a clearer picture of what they wanted to study or how they were going to go about it, well, then they should probably start with the student success studies for inspiration and use that priority area of the guide to help design their study. If they were more flexible or just less sure about what they were saying was measurable, well, then they could look at the teaching and learning portions of the report. The next thing we did for each priority area was to highlight significant trends that we found in our interviews and in our content analysis. We were especially concerned with ones that highlighted different factors that researchers who are designing studies in that area should be aware of. So for instance, in the enhancing teaching and learning area, we spotlighted the different levels of teaching and learning that exist that we found in the literature. We then narrowed the focus a bit more to look at one specific way of looking at student learning, and that was student engagement. So to kind of recap, if you knew quite a bit about teaching and learning, perhaps you only had to read the first parts of the general discussion that defined how we were using those terms and perhaps what the major trends that we identified were. If you didn't know as much about teaching and learning, well, then you could read a little bit more about the topic. And you could even do some searches on areas like student engagement to find more information. In the next section for each priority area, we looked at things from a practitioner level. So let's say you weren't super interested in doing research, but you wanted to know what some effective practices to support student learning or teaching were. Well, that's why we gave you a list of those as well. Finally, for each area, we gave one exemplary study. Now, as you can probably imagine, looking through hundreds of studies and picking the one that best exemplified some made-up areas of research that we created, it was pretty tough. But the folks at ACRL and the librarians who gave us feedback throughout the process thought it would be good to give some concrete examples of studies that had been done, so we included them. We tried to be pretty transparent in how we picked these studies, but we did get some pushback. Some people thought that other studies better exemplified things. Some thought that some studies were just better in general. And actually, I remember that specifically for this area, the very librarians from the institution, where the study that we picked as exemplary was conducted, actually had some issues with it. But I'm happy that they got a chance to give us the feedback, even though that was a little unexpected. So anyhow, now I'm going to turn this over to Jill, who's going to talk you through the process of creating a research question in this particular priority area.
Thank you, Stephanie. So this priority area, enhanced teaching and learning, was used to identify the more indirect effect of the library on students. As Stephanie explained, this differs slightly from student success, which is a separate priority area. These indirect effects fall into the category of student engagement. Student engagement is well-researched and well-defined in higher education research. It is the interaction between time, effort, and other relevant resources to optimize the student experience. The objective for this priority area is to connect library resources to student engagement. This objective is written, as it is written, is very broad, since both library resources and student engagement can mean a number of different things. Over the next few minutes, I will break this down a bit to help you think about working this objective into a testable research question. To begin a discussion about student engagement, I have to mention the work of George Koo. George Koo has written extensively about student engagement, and if you are unfamiliar with this topic, his work is a good place to start. So he defines it as the extent to which students are engaging both inside and outside the classroom in activities that research has shown are linked with measurable learning outcomes. You can find examples of engagement indicators on the National Survey of Student Engagement, or the NSSE, as well as in high-impact educational practices. I'm not going to spend a lot of time listing these various engagement indicators here because you can easily look them up. But I will say that it is important to think about what student engagement means and what those examples look like in order to make connections between the library and student engagement. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are coded with both color and format to help you follow along with developing a research question. So here we have our objective with different words highlighted in different colors and formats. So the orange or bold part is the resource. The blue or the underlined part is the population. The green or italics part is the thing being measured. So as you begin to craft your research question, you need to be specific in each of these areas. For example, the resources could take many forms, including spaces, collections, and other library services. The population can also take many forms. Which students are you talking about? Considering the different levels is one way to do it, but you could also think about researching a specific student population, like first generation or first year students or some other group. And then what are you measuring? What is the type of engagement that you're wanting to study? So consider your campus. What student engagement initiatives does your library currently support? What initiatives could your library support? Which students are already engaged in these activities and which students might not be engaged? Answering these questions can help you get started. Remember, you can use that literature search tool that Stephanie talked about to help you get ideas. Next slide. Okay, so here we have our objective, followed by one of the suggested research questions to get us started. So the research question is, how are library spaces, online or physical, affecting engagement among students? So this is one of the research questions that's in the report in the section of questions requiring further study. But again, these questions aren't perfect research questions as they are written and will need further defined to fit your own institutional context as well as your own research interests. Each of the highlighted words in this research question are still very broad. So let's think through each of these to make this question more specific. Library spaces. Which spaces do we want to focus on? Are we talking about online spaces or physical spaces? If they're physical spaces, where are they located? What makes them unique? Engagement. This is a big one. Think back to that definition of what engagement means. What is the educationally effective activity that the students are doing? If you want to look at more than one educationally effective activity, you should probably write more than one research question. And then again, students. Which students are we talking about? Be sure to specify the specific student population. Okay, so here's the research question that I have revised using some specific examples. Now the research question reads, how are library group study spaces affecting the collaborative learning of undergraduate students in learning communities? Let me explain to you how I got there. Let's say, for example, that your library provides designated group study spaces for different student groups. You want to know if this designated space affects engagement for the students who use that space. One of the groups who have a study space are students enrolled in a learning community. So a learning community, the definition can vary from institution to institution, but it usually means a cohort of students who are taking a class together, or maybe they live together, or both. At my institution, we have two kinds of learning communities, one of which are students who take two classes together, a cohort of students who take two classes together, and the other is a group of students who take one class together but also live together. So it can vary. So one of the goals of the learning community at my institution is collaborative learning, which also happens to be an engagement indicator on the NESI. In this example, I have specified the physical library space as group study spaces. The student population who uses those spaces are undergraduate students who are also part of a formal learning community, and the measure of engagement is collaborative learning. So now that we have a good research question, we need to think about data collection and methods we will use to answer our question. To start, you should look to the previous research. You can use a literature search tool we mentioned earlier, and obviously you can also search the higher education literature for information on both collaborative learning and learning communities. Next, you should think about the data that you already have. Maybe students sign in to use the space, or library staff take periodic head counts of the group study rooms. Maybe students are required by the course instructor to meet with their groups on certain days of the week or for certain hours during the week. You also will need to think about the data that you need. You will need more than numbers of students using the space in order to answer this particular research question. You need to know what they are doing that connects with collaborative learning. So again, you will need to define what goes into collaborative learning so that you know the data that you need to collect. One point that is connected to collaborative learning on the NESI is working with other students on a course project or assignment. So maybe you can collect data on this by observing what students are doing in the space, thus creating an observational study. You can connect with the learning community coordinators or the instructors to find out what kinds of assignments and activities they may be working on, and then watch for the collaborative learning behaviors that will help them do that. Another point that is connected to collaborative learning is asking another student for help with understanding the course's material. You might be able to collect this data by surveying students and asking them not only if they ask for help, but if they use the time spent in the group study space in order to do so. So asking yourself, what data do I need to answer this question, will help you design your methodology for collecting the data. It also might end up with a revision of your research question, but I didn't go quite that far in my example. Okay, so next slide. I think that this is a good time to pause and address any questions that we have up to this point. I don't see any lingering questions in the chat, so we'll give it a minute for any new questions before I pass it back to Stephanie. Okay, we'll have another time for questions built in. I'll pass it along to Seth.
All right, thank you, Jill. So going back to the poll results for the poll that we took at the beginning of this webinar, it looked like a majority of you were interested in this area, quantifying the library's impact on student success, which is not horribly surprising, and it's great. So let's just talk about this priority area. So once again, we begin the general discussion, we define the difference between student learning and success, and then we give some examples of these more quantifiable or objective measures used by studies in this area. We then talk a little bit about the trends that we saw in the literature and in the interviews, and one of them was that there seemed to be fewer of these studies that we saw, as the years went on. So from there, we talked about some of the barriers that might exist to doing these types of studies, and then ways to overcome these barriers. So of course, privacy was kind of a huge concern for the librarians, and that's why we then talked about the different levels of analysis. A major issue with privacy was that librarians were uncomfortable with the idea of looking at individual student data, and for good reason. So that's why we introduced, or we talked about the idea of, well, maybe you can look at groups of students. So what sorts of groupings of students make sense? So for instance, classes, a specific class of students, like an average class grade, that will be one way. You can also look at different groups of students, perhaps different cohorts, so students that start at a different year or in a different semester, or maybe students that were in their first year or their second year. Another way, like Jill mentioned, was looking at students in specific learning communities. So there are ways of looking, it's not just you have to have individual student data or nothing, or you can't do research in this area, but to kind of think of the other possibilities. And then of course, there's the idea of, well, where can you get this information? So then that kind of leads us to the next area, which was the effective practices to implement. And we list some partners that we think might support getting this data. So of course, the Office of Institutional Research is, a major source. But if your school doesn't have one, or for whatever they're unwilling to work with you, there are other ways, such as like the department, or perhaps the course coordinator might be comfortable giving overall averages for the different classes. And then that might be a way to kind of get your feet wet doing research in this area. And then if you find something interesting, well, then maybe then you would go looking for more individual level student data. With our exemplary study, it probably surprised no one that we picked this one because it is off-cited, but rarely emulated. So let's go through creating a research question for this area. Next slide, please. All right, so the basic objective of any study in this area is probably to correlate or relate library resources to some sort of student success outcome. Next slide, please. All right, and so once again, we'll be using orange or bold, relates to the library resource, blue or underline relates to the population, and green or italics relates to the thing being measured. Next slide, please. So with the research question, one of the ones that we came up with in the report was, well, how do library resources and programs impact indicators of student success? So this is a very broad research question. A little bit about what went into the thought behind the research question. We wanted to have questions that had different levels of specificity. So we wanted ones that highlighted what we saw as being, major or potential areas of research, but we also wanted to get some general ones. So if you kind of had more of an idea of more of the variables or what you wanted to study, well, you could just swap out the words that we had. So you could swap out like a different resource, so a different collection or space or service for what you actually wanted to study. But you kind of had like the bare bones or the structure of the question to make sure that, as Holly mentioned, it was something that would be an open-ended question and wouldn't just be like a closed question. In the early stages of this, our way of coming up with the research questions actually sort of looked like a Mad Libs, where we had, well, you could look at like box A and you could fill in any of the words from box A in this particular part of the question, or you could look in box B for this other part. But apparently using Mad Libs was unprofessional, so we were not allowed to do that. So this was sort of our compromise. Next slide, please. All right. So once again, we're going to say how do library resources and programs, and of course, those are the orange things. Students are still blue, and success, once again, is the green. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're putting in some more details. So to what extent does library instruction, that's sort of the library resource or service we're going to focus on, how does that correlate with class GPAs? Class GPA, I would define that as being sort of the overall grade that the students got on whatever your GPA scale is, 4 points usually. And then we're going to look at undergraduates. So this is still kind of broad, but you can see that we're kind of narrowing down our focus to the resources, populations, and activities that matter most to me, or that I'm most interested in. So next slide, please. Okay. So what you need to then do when you're looking at a study like this is decide, okay, so what are the classes that would lend themselves to this sort of study? And so one way to think about that is by department. So one of those studies that I'm working on now is looking at the impact that library instruction is having on our English 102, which is our basic writing course. This is a good class for us to look at because even there are several sections of it, which is important. But another factor that makes this kind of like a good class to look at is that the the instructors for this class every semester before they teach have to go through sort of like a workshop where they make sure that they are grading the student essays similarly. So I believe that they have to be like within half the grade of each other. And this is great because you're sort of, the department itself is sort of renorming the grading process every semester so that, you know, a student in one class would probably get like the same grade as if they had taken the course with another instructor. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way that we're looking at it is, well, we can look at it by semester, but we can also look at it by teacher. So we can see when the teacher has taught, and we can connect that with our data for the classes we've actually done instruction for, and then see, well, is there a difference in maybe a semester where we did instruction versus where we didn't? And then in this case, we're using the teacher as kind of the level of analysis as opposed to the semester that the class is being offered. Once again, different ways of looking at the data. And the good thing is that it's using data that we can kind of tease apart ourselves. One place we're looking for the data is looking at the student satisfaction surveys. So that ensures that we have a complete listing of all the classes available. And actually, one of the surprising things that we didn't expect to find was that we thought that we were doing instruction for most of the classes. But if I had to guess, I would have said, well, we're probably getting maybe like 60 or 70% of the classes. When we actually looked at the full list of classes that were being taught and the sections that the libraries actually came and did instruction for, we found that the percentage of classes that we were doing instruction for was much higher. 90 was the average over the last 3 years, and there was even a couple semesters where we actually spoke to 100% of the classes. So that was kind of nice to find out. So that actually, you know, we had to go back and then, well, then how does that affect our study? Do we actually have enough classes where the librarians didn't come and taught to the class that we can compare this to? But it was one way of looking at the data that we could do before we even looked at the actual grades. We're fortunate in that the Office of Institutional Research is willing to partner with us and give us the grades for those classes. But the other way we could have gone is going right to the writing program, all right, or even emailing the professors individually and asking if they'd be willing to share. So that is just, once again, a way of how you can use the report to kind of fill in what's important to you contextually. And that's all I have to say. So next slide, please. So once again, you are encouraged to share any questions, and I see there are a couple in there. So one question we had, is there any way to share successful IRB proposals that have appropriate and approved procedures for acquiring and protecting individual student data that we could use as templates? Well, that's an excellent question. I know that when I've gone to, different conferences and I've asked like specific librarians if they were interested in talking about it, they were more than willing to share their IRBs. And actually, I got one from when I did a talk in Oklahoma. So I think that might be one way, but perhaps ACRL, that could be something they could look into if that's like an area where librarians need more support, is actually finding the language or the procedures for the IRB process. Maybe that could also be added to our database of studies. I don't know if any of my other panelists have anything they want to say.
Yeah, I think it's something we can definitely investigate, with the caveat that from my own experience, a procedure that has been approved at one institution may not be approved at another, simply because the types of review conducted by IRBs at different institutions does vary a little bit. But certainly I think there's no reason not to share best practices.
Okay, well, that's certainly something we can explore. Any other questions before we move on to the final section? All right, not seeing any questions. We'll have a few minutes at the end as well, I think. So if anything occurs to you, please feel free to type them in at any point. I will just spend the last few minutes talking briefly about the Academic Library Impact Research Grants. We have just opened the call for proposals for the second round of grants. This is a program that directly resulted from the Academic Library Impact Report that the other panelists have been talking about, and it was recommended by the authors as a way to support the uptake of this report. So it's built into the report itself and those recommendations. So applications are due April 25th. You can find the CFP and more information on the ACRL website at that URL. I'll just go through a few things briefly in terms of the process and what we're looking for. So as well as being related to the Academic Library Impact Report, this program also supports the Value of Academic Libraries portion of the ACRL strategic plan. That's what all of the other panelists are members of the Value of Academic Libraries Committee, so this is a big part of their work. And the goal there is to help academic libraries demonstrate alignment with an impact on institutional outcomes. And you can see the different objectives and the ways that the committee works to do those things. And we'll come back to this briefly. So for the Academic Library Impact Research Grants, just a few logistical details. As I mentioned, the applications are due at the end of April, so this will be after the ACRL 2019 conference in Cleveland. And if you're attending the conference, we will have some of the recipients from the first round of research grants actually presenting in a session at the conference. So you'd be more than welcome to come and hear their some of their preliminary results. The grants are for up to $3,000 each, and that $3,000 is for research costs. So whether it's you need support to hire a research assistant, to run focus groups, to maybe use specialized software, those are the sorts of things you could apply for to have this grant help support your research. To be eligible, you must be an ACRL member, so the person who is the project lead has to be an individual member and employed in an academic or research library. The research you're proposing should be feasible to complete in approximately a 12-month period. The grant funding would be dispersed in the summer, probably in June, and then would cover a 12-month period from that time. And recipients are also required to disseminate the results of their research. And what we have changed in the program this year is that in addition to the up to $3,000 that you can apply for the research, if you receive a grant, you're eligible to then apply for an additional $1,500 in funding to help with dissemination costs. So if it is worthwhile for you to go to a conference, or if you need other funding to help you disseminate your results, that's something that grant recipients will be eligible for. So applications, I think, fairly straightforward. You need to submit the cover sheet for the application form, your CV or resume, an abstract, a budget. There's a worksheet online. And then the most important part is a project proposal. So just briefly, the proposal should contain a lot of the elements that Jill and staff have talked about based on the Academic Library Impact Report. We'll be looking, the committee from VAL will be looking for a clear statement of your research objectives and questions, a methodology that relates to answering those questions, a description of your research activities, so how you plan to answer your questions, a timeline of what you'll be doing when, and if it's a collaborative project, we'll also look for how the different members of the team would be contributing to that. Expected outcomes and plans for dissemination. So again, what you hope to achieve by the end of this research period. You don't have to have specific dissemination plans at this point, but we'd just like some indication of what might appropriate avenues be for disseminating your results. And then perhaps most significantly, the statement of how your research is significant. This is kind of the so what question that's really important to answer in any research project is what benefit will this be to the field, to other academic libraries? How will this improve the literature and what we know about this area? In terms of evaluation, there are just 4 primary criteria. The need for support, so is this support necessary for this research to be undertaken? Is the research original enough to justify funding? Again, related to originality, the need for research, will this fill an existing gap? Does it advance the priority areas that were outlined in the report? Are those ideas well conceived and well described? The project design, so this again is this alignment between the research question and the methodology, and how realistic it is to do this and to do it within the time frame. And then the alignment with objectives, and this relates both to the Academic Library Impact Report and to the Value of Academic Library goals and objectives in the ACRL strategic plan. And I think, generally speaking, last year with some of the proposals, this is where we saw weaknesses, particularly that it didn't show a clear alignment with the report or with the VAL section of the strategic plan. So if you're considering applying, I would recommend that you be sure to look closely at those things. Okay, so finally, just to wrap up, if there are any outstanding questions about any section of the webinar, please type in the chat box now. We have a few minutes left, and I'm sure any of the panelists would be happy to answer questions. So we'll give it a minute. Okay, a question about the grants. So You didn't mention the equity, diversity, and inclusion aspect, but the call for applications mentioned this being a priority. Could you speak a little more to supporting this aspect with the grant applications? Holly or Jill, did you want to talk about this?
Sure, I'll talk about it. In ACRL's Plan for Excellence, which is its strategic plan, the value of academic libraries has a goal area, but within that, the goal of academic libraries demonstrate alignment with and impact on institutional outcomes. There is a specific objective around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and it is support libraries in articulating their role in advancing issues of equity, access, diversity, and inclusion in higher education. So the objective is really for academic and research libraries to be able to make the case for how they contribute to institutional outcomes around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And for the impact grants, of course, we would very much like to see a well thought out research question and a research proposal around that very objective. But if there are ways to work aspects of equity, diversity, inclusion into the research, that would also be something that we would very much like to see. And since it's equity, diversity, inclusion, we can think of it very broadly. And so if you're considering a certain population, you could have a research question that focused on that. It could be at-risk students, first-generation students, that sort of thing, or it can be very specific in terms of how libraries are working around issues of racial inequality, but it really also needs to be tied to that value of academic libraries goal area. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So the 6 priority areas, obviously the equity, diversity, and inclusion language isn't in any of them, but it could be a lens through which you look at any of them. So it can relate to both the objectives and the priority areas in the report. Yes, and as Steph has just mentioned in the chat box, diversity and inclusion is a facet in the literature search tool listed under other thematic codes, so you can use the literature search tool as well to find existing research that relates to that area.
And I guess one last thing there, I think that, or it at least appears to me that there is less published research in this area, and that is another reason why we would like to see more research.
Definitely. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we will wrap up there. My contact information is on the screen, so if you have any questions for me or for any of the other panelists, I'd be happy to forward them as well. So thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you found this useful.